Hi there, welcome to Premium Builds, I'm John. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the new Ampere GPUs from Nvidia. We spent the last week running them through their paces so that we can get a gauge of their performance and make recommendations as to what system they're best suited to. We've obtained examples of the RTX 3060 Ti, the 3070 and the 3080. We've run a set of benchmark tests that we think represent the current spread of titles that you're going to want to see these cards performing well in. For first-person shooters, we've chosen Rainbow Six Siege to represent a well-optimised competitive game where high frame count matters. We've tested Call of Duty Warzone because it's a very popular game, but it's more demanding in terms of system specification, and we run it for a full battle royale to log performance. Finally, we've chosen Doom Eternal because it's exceptionally well coded and allows these GPUs to shine even at higher settings. For the AAA titles, we've tested Red Dead Repemption 2 as an example of the current state of the art. It runs well, but it makes stern demands on the graphics card in particular. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is well optimised and runs well on most GPUs, but it shows clear performance scaling with more powerful hardware, and it also has a very consistent inbuilt benchmark. We've also worked hard on a robust testing methodology for Flight Simulator 2020. Our test here involves an AI-controlled flight at low level across New York City. This was considered unplayable by many on release with frame rates in the teens, but updates to the game and these powerful graphics cards mean that it's far from the case now, as you will see in our results. This suite of games gives us an overview of the GPU's capabilities. We've tested at 1080p, 1440p, 1440p Ultrawide and 4K. I'd like to point out that we've chosen a testing methodology here that differs from many others. I've chosen settings that show these games in their best light, and that's not always ultra across the board. We've tested most games here on high settings, allowing the GPUs to shine and giving you a better understanding of how you can expect them to perform in the real world. From the numbers here, you'll be able to tweak settings to obtain higher quality or higher frame rates, whichever you prefer, but you can expect performance on a par with our numbers here. Where we identify a clear CPU bottleneck, we'll tell you about it. The test system is our Ryzen rig with a Ryzen 5800X, 16GB of RAM running at 3600MHz CL16 and a B550 motherboard. First, let's take a quick look at some synthetic tests so we can see how these cards stack up and verify that they're performing correctly. We're just looking at the GPU scores here. Firestrike uses DirectX 12, which is an older API now, and we get an idea of how closely matched the GTX 1080 Ti and the RX 5700 XT are, and in this case the RTX 3060 Ti as well. TimeSpy uses the DirectX 12 API and is more representative of current games. Here the RTX 3060 Ti fares better, but it's clear the 3080 still has a really big lead. Finally, we can take a look at Port Royal to assess the relative ray tracing capabilities of the RTX-enabled GPUs. This test uses DirectX 12's ray tracing commands to render out a complex scene full of shadows, reflections and lighting sources over and above the traditionally rasterized rendering of the core 3D scene. Despite using last generation RTX cores, the RTX 2080 Ti acquits itself well here, and there's a fair gap between the performance of the 3060 Ti, 3070 and 3080 commensurate with their RTX core counts and overall rendering ability. The RTX 2060 brings up the rear, the least powerful of the cards with RTX capabilities. Moving on to games and 1080p performance, I've grouped these graphs together to keep things simple. In Rainbow Six Siege we see good 1080p scaling, but even an entry-level GPU is capable of fairly insane frame rates here. Doom Eternal is really well optimised and shows good scaling with GPU power. Everything from the RX 5700 XT and up exceeds 240 FPS. Call of Duty Warzone on high settings, we see all the Ampere cards exceed 200 FPS average, but you're not gaining a huge amount from the additional cost and power of the RTX 3080. I think we're seeing the ceiling of the 5800X's performance here, although lows don't suffer like they can in some titles when CPU bound. Note the hard limit of 250 FPS for the hives in all the Ampere GPUs. As for the AAA titles, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider we're seeing all the GPUs exceed 144 FPS at 1080p, with the 3080 nearing 200 FPS. Of note here is that the 3070 was 78% GPU bound, and the 3080 was only 50% GPU bound. Even with a Ryzen 5800X, GPU performance is being left on the table in this title, with the higher performing Ampere GPUs in this game at 1080p. In Red Dead Redemption 2, a more demanding title, the high settings loads GPUs even at 1080p. The 2080 Ti and 3080 are the only GPUs to exceed 100 FPS average, but in this title we're really looking for a consistent 60 frames per second at high settings, and everything from a 1080 Ti to a 5700 XT and upwards is capable of that here. Like Doom Eternal, the Vulkan APIs help the 5700 XT perform. AMD cards respond well to this API. And finally, in Flight Sim 2020, 1080p means that the CPU performance is as exposed as GPU performance. We see minor performance improvements from the higher tier cards, but even the 3080 only just hits 60 frames per second. That's a function of the demanding nature of this test, flying over New York City at low level. As you'd expect at 1080p, all of these GPUs perform very well, and we do see utilisation drop below 100% on occasions as they wait for the CPU to process the game data. Ultra settings see performance drop by about 10 frames per second. Looking at 1440p settings, this resolution is much better suited to these GPUs. In Call of Duty Warzone, we still see them all exceed 144 frames per second average at high settings. The RTX 2080 Ti marginally outperforms the Ampere cards here. That could be down to it being an established card with optimised drivers, whilst the Ampere cards are newer, but note that they don't scale well. The 3080 isn't getting you substantially more performance in this title over the much cheaper 3060 Ti. Rainbow Six Siege shows excellent scaling with the more powerful GPUs, and the RTX 3080 really stretches its legs to deliver a 400 FPS average. Even the 3060 Ti exceeds 260 frames per second. We're well into diminishing returns here since we've exceeded even the fast monitor's refresh rate, and generally this is a title that would be played at 1080p. Note that the 2060 KO and below run on a Ryzen 3600. This likely accounts for some of the performance difference here, but it's not huge. We'll be looking further into CPU scaling later. Doom Eternal is really well optimised and lets the higher end hardware shine. Again, we see the power of the 3080 compared to the 2080 Ti, and Nvidia's claim re the 3070 matching the 2080 Ti ring true. Doom has a very well refined settings system. Each graphics preset adds or removes about 10 FPS, so you can fine tune the game to your liking, but all of these GPUs give a fluid, exciting experience at 1440p and over 100 frames per second. Even the 1660 Super hits 90 FPS average. It's still very enjoyable, but you might want to reduce settings a notch or two. Moving on to AAA titles at 1440p, Red Dead Redemption can make the most powerful graphics cards sweat, and I have settings turned up here. That's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's a game that should be experienced in all its glory at higher settings, and secondly, because it shows a significant break in performance between the cards that can maintain 60 frames per second average and those that can't. Last generation cards struggle, whilst the 3060 Ti comfortably maintains nearly 70 FPS, and the 3070, 2080 Ti and 3080 all approach 100 frames per second average. Again, you can tweak settings to get performance you're happy with, as they are turned right up here, but those GPUs are capable of providing an excellent experience at 1440p. Looking at Shadow of the Tomb Raider, again this title shows where the 1660 Super begins to struggle, although it is still capable of running well optimised titles like this at 1440p. The scaling with the more powerful GPUs is clear, with all of the Ampere GPUs exceeding 100 frames per second average. This is at highest settings, but Shadow of the Tomb Raider is DLSS 1.0 and RTX capable. Those settings show some interesting impacts on performance, but I'll go into deeper detail in that in an upcoming roundup of those technologies. For now, you can see that the 3080 is the card that manages to exceed 144 FPS at 1440p in this title with settings cranked. At 1440p in Flight Simulator, we're now becoming GPU bound, as can be seen in my results. 50 to 60 FPS average at high-end settings is really good performance in this test, and it looks utterly gorgeous doing it. All of the GPUs exceed 30 frames per second at all times. 1440p is where Flight Sim 2020 really begins to shine, and the RTX 3060 Ti in particular impressed me with its performance here. Lifting settings to Ultra adds some nice visual tweaks, but costs about 10 frames per second across the board. Again, there's room to tweak here with just a couple of detail settings turned down from Ultra, getting you most of the performance benefits at almost no detriment to visuals. To conclude, at 1440p we can really see these cards start to come alive, but it was the 3060 Ti that really impressed me in these tests. It's very much in the same ballpark of performance as its bigger siblings, and once you're achieving 100 frames per second in AAA titles with settings turned up, there's not really much more you can ask for from a graphics card. Moving on then to 1440p Ultrawide, this resolution bridges the gap to 4K and it's becoming increasingly popular. Certainly I'm a big fan of the increased workspace a 1440p Ultrawide monitor gives, combined with the increased immersion you get in demanding AAA games. The first-person shooters still post high FPS if they're well optimised. Rainbow Six Siege is generating over 250 frames per second in high settings. COD Warzone really does seem to be CPU limited. Frames per second don't really drop much from 1440p, so you're at no penalty for opting for ultra-wide. Doom Eternal is still generating well over 144 frames per second on everything except the 1080 Ti, and we're at ultra nightmare settings here. Moving on to AAA titles, we're exceeding 60 frames per second in Red Dead Redemption 2 on all the Ampere cards at demanding settings. The 3060 Ti and the 3070 are again relatively close in performance, with 10 frames per second between them, with only the 3080 distinguishing itself by 20 frames per second. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is much the same pattern, but with slightly higher frame rates. The 3070, 3080 and 2080 Ti all approach or exceed 100 frames per second. And finally, at 1440p ultrawide, we see the same scaling in Flight Simulator 2020. They all approach or exceed 50 frames per second, even at this resolution, which is impressive. And again, you can see that you're paying a great deal in going from an RTX 3060 Ti to an RTX 3070 and onto an RTX 3080 to go from a 46 frames per second average to 60 frames per second average. Whether that's worthwhile to you simply comes down to your budget and expectations in this title. The takeaways here are really how closely the RTX 3070 matches the 2080 Ti, and I don't think that's an accident. I think Nvidia have very carefully managed its performance to ensure that their claims ring true. We're also seeing that the hierarchy of cards is very clearly established, with clear performance delineations between them. The 3060 Ti isn't a bit part player here, it's very much keeping pace with its more expensive siblings. You're not going to notice a difference between, say, 160 and 190 frames per second in a first-person shooter, or 80 and 90 frames per second in a AAA title. It's only really if you want to turn settings right up or you're hunting every last frame in a competitive game that you should consider the 3070. If you're looking to manage your budget, then the 3060 Ti is a really good option. It'll get you almost all of the performance, but at $150 or so less. The 3070 is clearly excellent at 1440p ultrawide, but the 3060 Ti is capable as well. Moving on to 4K, we're now moving on to a resolution that really makes these GPUs work for their supper. Looking first at the first-person shooters, we can see that we're still exceeding 100 frames per second in Doom Eternal and Call of Duty Warzone. And we're still at high settings here as well. Likewise, in Rainbow Six Siege, we're exceeding 144 frames per second, meaning you'll be maximising a high-performance 4K monitor. Not that this is an ideal setup for competitive play. The RTX 3080 is still pushing past 300 frames per second, but the 3060 Ti and 3070 are much lower here, and I confirmed this with multiple runs. I think that maybe the lower memory speeds could be an issue at 4K, but I can't confirm that. AAA titles are where you can revel in the detail rendering at 4K gives, but we're starting to see all of these GPUs struggling to make the magic 60 frames per second. You're going to have to turn down settings a little from those I've used throughout these benchmarks. Again, we see the 3070 shadowing the 2080 Ti closely, although the 2080 Ti does come out on top, just in these three tests. The 3080 has a clear advantage, and if you're building a 4K focused gaming rig, then it's really between the 3080 and the RX 6800 XT from AMD as to which GPU is right for you. So what are my conclusions from these tests? Firstly, the 3060 Ti was the standout card for me. It performs excellently, to the point where I'd failed to identify it in a blind test against the RTX 3070 in most of these titles. In well-optimised games and first-person shooters, it's producing fluid, responsive gameplay at high FPS and high settings. In demanding titles, it's punching well above its weight. It's a great card, and if you're looking to trade off components in your system to afford a better CPU, monitor or SSD, you should absolutely consider the 3060 Ti. It won't feel like a compromised choice at all. Secondly, none of the Ampere cards achieve their potential at 1080p in my opinion. They're either exposing CPU limitation in very high FPS titles, or else not shining in AAA titles restricted by a lower pixel count. There's perhaps a case for the RTX 3060 Ti in either a very high FPS esports build, or a PC aimed at playing AAA titles at 1080p in very high settings. But really, I'd recommend that if you're considering any of these Ampere cards, you should start your search with a 1440p monitor capable of 144Hz and adaptive sync. That's where you start getting your money's worth out of these GPUs. Finally, of course, there's the RTX 3080. This GPU is an absolute monster and it clearly wins every benchmark here. Whilst the RTX 3070 has clearly been pegged to the RTX 2080 Ti, and the RTX 3060 Ti massaged to ensure it's 10% or so slower than that, the RTX 3080 is allowed to stretch its legs and hit the limits of this generation's capability. Realistically then, I'd recommend the RTX 3060 Ti as a high FPS 1080p esports card, or a 1440p all-rounder. The RTX 3070 is a rock-solid 1440p card for AAA titles and high settings. At 1440p ultrawide, you can opt for the RTX 3070, or the RTX 3080 really shines. And finally, at 4K, it's such a demanding resolution that in high-end titles like Red Dead Redemption or Cyberpunk, you will need to lower settings from Ultra to maintain 60 frames per second, even on an RTX 3080. There is one ace up the Ampere GPU sleeve though, the LSS. This technology from Nvidia uses a trained neural network and AI to upsample the rendered image for display. When it works well, it allows you to combine heightened settings with higher frame rates. However, just a handful of titles are using it to its full potential, so it's something I'm looking into, and I'll present my results on it later. I'm also interested in the thermal performance of these cards and their power limits, so I'll be producing further videos on each one, looking at thermals, overclocking potential, and their suitability for use in small form factor cases. I hope you found this video informative. Please like and subscribe if you did. Head on over to premiumbuilds.com for all the latest build guides, component reviews, and parts selections for any budget or